Between Morphy and Pillsbury, the little-known James Mason may have been the strongest American chess master. He had a universal style, positionally outplaying many of his peers, but ultimately proving his worth with tactics as well. Today's game, my number 8 best chess game from before 1900, is a case in point. Mason plays with single-minded purpose, pursuing certain advantages against Simon Winawer and gaining a nearly decisive edge in the process. The final combination is one that has been published in numerous collections of combinations. Mason begins with e4. We get e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and bishop to c5. Now, at this time in chess history, a lot of players would be playing pawn to b4 and an Evans gambit. But this isn't Mason's style. He plays pawn d3, going for the quieter variations d6, and then bishop to e3. Now, this move kind of sets a tone for the early phases of this game. Bishop e3 is not the strongest move. It has a very specific idea. The idea is you take me, I'm going to recapture. Yes, I have doubled pawns, but I have a half-open f-file, and I can use that. And Mason is really going to build his entire game around this idea. You know, pawns may not love being doubled, but rooks love doubled pawns because they create open files. The thing is, this is a little bit too kind of on the nose by Mason, and it's actually a good idea here for Winawer to take this, and after pawn takes e3, knight f6 is a good reply. There's an idea of knight g4, which can be annoying, and a rapid f5 prepared by moving the knight to g4 or another square, and of course with castling and appropriate preparation, is actually quite good. You know, one downside of doubled pawns is a lot of times the structure around them can be a little bit loose, and a pawn break like f5 can be strong. This is actually a little bit better for black if black chooses to play in this way. But this is all really sophisticated, and I'm presenting stockfish analysis of the position and also kind of some understanding of this kind of position that's derived from modern grandmaster play. And the players don't have that at hand. So this very direct idea, encouraging the exchange on e3 and play on the f-file, is pretty effective against Winawer, who doesn't know how to counter it, and it's going to play out kind of through the rest of the game. So now we see bishop to b6, knight to d2, pawn to h6, a little bit slow, knight to f1, so the knight's heading around like this, and now knight f6, pawn h3, please stay out of g4, no thank you, knight to e7, knight to g3, pawn c6, bishop b3, and finally Winawer cannot stand the tension anymore and he exchanges on e3. After f takes e3, he plays queen b6 and he's pressuring this e3 point. Now, I want to be clear, this is actually a pretty good way to play for Winawer. Now, queen b6 may not be the best, but after exchanging on e3, he actually has an advantage, and that advantage is going to grow in the subsequent moves. But it really feels like even if Stockfish is saying that black has an advantage, Winawer doesn't really know how to play the position from here, and Mason is very focused on, let me just bring pressure on the f-file, and I'm going to be able to create an advantage from that pressure. And this idea is going to work for Mason. So here we get queen to d2, a little bit slow, but again, we have one idea that we're focusing on. So Stockfish's recommended d4 is not part of the idea of just keeping the structure and going to play on the f-file. Now, pawn to a5, there's an idea of pawn a4 and going after b2. So c3, Stockfish really liked playing a4 to stop this idea and kind of submit the pawn on a5. And now pawn to a4, the bishop needs to fall back, bishop back to d1. You can't really go here, of course, because the b2 pawn would hang. Bishop to e6, castles, queen c7, knight h4, focused on this f5 square and the half-open f-file, right? Pawn to b5, and now bishop c2, pawn c5, knight g2 f5, bishop takes, knight takes, rook takes. And now in this position, at this point, Stockfish still likes black. I think Mason's really got everything that he's going for here, and it doesn't feel like Winawer knows what he should do. The play here for black seems to be the move pawn to a3. Now, in this position, Mason would not want to kind of compromise the queenside pawn structure by capturing over here or by allowing Winawer to capture on b2. So the natural move to play here is pawn to b3. And in this position, I think the reason that black is better, according to the engine, is that this bishop really kind of sucks. It's not obvious how black can kind of transform the structure in a way that is advantageous, but you basically have good minor piece versus bad minor piece, and black can simply go ahead and castle, ignore any kind of pressure here on the f file, which doesn't have a concrete threat, and be better in the position. But that's pretty sophisticated, and it takes a lot of good play from here to kind of prove that idea has merit. Instead, Winawer plays knight to d7. He's going to try to deal with the pressure on the f file here by following up with pawn to f6. So Mason's play now gets a compromise from his opponent because the light squares are super, super weak. So the play on the f file has now turned into play on the light squares, and good news, he's got a light squared bishop, so that's definitely going to favor him. And he immediately pulls back with bishop d1 and says, hey, these are very juicy, let me head over there. Pawn to a3, bishop to h5 check, king to e7, and b3. Now, it might look like this position is really locked up and could just be a draw, but of course, white is actually a lot better. Again, all of these pieces are better than their counterparts, and the position is not that locked. There is always the possibility of pawn d4 here. So now rook to f8, rook to f3, knight to b6, rook to g3, tickling this point right here, possibly trying to induce pawn to g5, which could be met by, among other things, pawn to h4. Lines will start opening. Lines opening is going to favor white. Also, if pawn g5, you don't have to go for something like h4. You can just pile up on the f pawn, which becomes weaker if the g pawn moves. You know, sometimes if you deal with pressure on one target, you actually soften up other points. So rook g3 here, king to d8. The king is trying to get out of the king side where it's feeling pressure from these pieces. And now bishop to g4. d4 was actually well timed here. You can't get better timing for a move like d4 than when your opponent's king is on that file. But still, bishop g4 is a good move. Queen to e7, bishop to e2. Now we're thinking about d4 with a soft pawn being here. King c7, d4. This pawn is targeted like I just highlighted, so pawn c4, trying to make sure that white can't get that, but this allows lines to open up right away. Rook b1, Mason actually chooses not to open the lines right away, but black can't stop this, so the idea is still paying off. Pawn g5, and now pawn takes c4, pawn takes c4, hello, open b file. You know, this is a beautiful, beautiful line for white, and this advantage is now really bordering on decisive. Rook to b4, how do you defend this pawn? Queen to e6, well, you don't defend it for very long. Pawn to d5, severing the defense by the queen here. And after the queen falls back, bishop takes c4. The pawn falls, and maybe more important than the pawn falling is that there are now more open lines on the queen side for the white pieces, including this square on c6 for the bishop. But there is one thing that black has gained here. It is access to this nice blockading post, and the knight is headed to c5, where it will be quite effective. Bishop to b5, knight to c5, and now queen to e2. Thinking about the light squares again on the other side of the board, the bishop has shifted from attacking on the king side where it was to attacking on the queen side, and the queen is now kind of making a shift from attacking on the queen side to the king side, so they've kind of shifted roles, and it's paying off for white. Here, pawn to f5 by Winawer, and this isn't really working because the lines are opening on the king side, but there wasn't really a move that was working, so I can't blame black for imploding. When there's no move that works, eventually you implode. So here, queen h5 was already really good, but instead pawn takes f5 first, maintaining pretty much all the advantages in the position. Pawn to e4 here. And now bishop to c6, attacking the rook. The rook goes to b8, and queen h5 from white. What's interesting here is, as well as things have gone for Mason, without queen h5 here, his advantage is no longer decisive. So he needed to find this move. He's timed it really well. The point on h6 is a big problem. How is black to defend that point? Well, the answer is that there's actually no move that defends h6 successfully. You don't want to play this move because then you're allowing this check, which is brutal. So you play rook to f6, but that allows Mason to switch from the positional play that he has been focused on to tactical play. This is a good moment to pause your video if you want to figure out the next move for white. Well, that next move is rook takes g5, which is very, very pretty. We love rook sacrifices, and this is only, maybe one of the rook sacrifices to come. Here, pawn takes g5 is played, and now we get queen h7 check. And in this position, if the king tries to fall back, king d8, then there's queen h8 check, king to e7. Here, queen g7 check. This is very nice. Of course, the king and rook are forked, and the only move that defends both of them is rook f7, but then pawn to f6 check. The king cannot go back to e8 because that square is covered by the bishop, and so now you can just capture the rook. Very, very nice, clean stuff. So after queen to h7 check, anticipating this idea of going in and forking the king and the rook, we have the move knight to d7. And in this position, there's just bishop takes d7. So if queen takes d7 here, which of course has to be considered, well, first off, yes, this endgame should be winning and fairly comfortable for white if you just trade on d7 and then pick up the loose rook on b8, but you're actually much better off if you play rook c4 check here. Now, you have to move the king to the only square that defends the queen, but after king to d8, there's queen h8 check again, forking the rook and the king over here, and after king e7, well, there's a lot of good moves, including going over here, but the best according to the computer is rook takes e4 check, and in this position, after the king moves over to f7, you pick up the queen like this, and mate actually follows really, really soon. So after bishop takes d7, black tries queen to g8, offering a queen trade here, and black is up the exchange, although white has a lot of pawns for it. And in this position, can you find the final blow that Mason played that has ended up in all of the combination books for excellent reasons? Well, that move is the brilliant rook to b7, a truly spectacular and unique pattern. Here the rook is offered to both the black rook and the black king, which is really a beautiful sequence here. The king cannot avoid taking the rook, or the rook cannot avoid taking the rook, because if you go back here, then there's just this, as well as capturing the rook on b8, everything is falling. So what about the two captures here? Well, if rook takes b7, then just queen takes g8, because your rook was defending the queen, and now it's not because it captured a rook. You can also capture the bishop here, but then there's one more check, forking the king and rook, and immediately winning the rook. And of course, this is totally winning up so much material. So after rook b7, played in the game is king takes b7. And now white is down with a bishop for two rooks. What's the follow-up? Well, it's the surprising move bishop to c8 check, a really unique interference. So this is double check. When it's a double check, the only way to get out of check is to move the king, right? You can't capture both of the pieces that are giving check, and you can't block both of the checks. So you have to move the king. And this bishop check has cut off the rook's defense of the queen, so no matter where the king moves, including if it captures the bishop here, the queen is falling. And if the king captures the bishop after the queen falls, there's also this fork right here, and you're going to win this rook as well, like we've seen. So in the game, king a8 is played, and the queen falls. Black has two rooks for the bishop and queen, and chooses to play on, but there's really no good reason to play on. The bishop and the queen are easily winning here, and after resisting as best as possible, ultimately Winawer gives up in this position right here. If king a6, and that's the only square you can go to, then bishop c4 check forces you to block with a rook, and you're losing that rook, and white is up according to Stockfish plus 70, but we can just say this position is totally decisive, which is why Winawer surrendered in the game. So I hope you've enjoyed this game, a really beautiful game from Mason. I love how a positional idea, even if not perfect, really pays off for him here because he has a goal that his opponent isn't really able to counter with an effective plan in return. And then ultimately everything is finished off with tactics. I think in a lot of ways, that's really the model game and one that we can all learn from. If you want to see more of my favorite chess games from the years before 1900, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen.